Welcome back to Eyes on Israel. One of the terms you hear a lot about, if you follow news from Israel, is the West Bank. For example, on the previous episode of this show, we discussed a recent executive order signed by Joe Biden called Executive Order on Imposing Certain Sanctions on Persons Undermining Peace, Security, and Stability in the West Bank. We interviewed attorney Mark Zell. You should go back and watch that segment if you haven't seen it yet. When people speak of the potential creation of a Palestinian state, they're usually talking about creating it in the West Bank. But what is the West Bank? Where is it? What is it the bank of? What river does it sit on? The term West Bank refers to the areas called Judea and Samaria. Judea and Samaria are the central mountainous region of the land of Israel. The northern section is called Samaria. The southern section is called Judea. These areas include the biblical cities of Jerusalem, Hebron, Bethlehem, Shechem, Shiloh, and many others. In fact, over 70% of the events in the Hebrew Bible take place in the areas of Judea and Samaria. But Judea and Samaria are not only biblical names. These parts of the land of Israel were always known this way in all official records and documents throughout history. For example, here's a 1921 map of Mandatory Palestine, which was governed by Great Britain at the behest of the League of Nations after World War I. And in 1947, when the United Nations proposed a partition plan to divide Mandatory Palestine into two states, one Arab and one Jewish, the Jews accepted the plan and the Arabs rejected it. But this UN partition plan describes, quote, the boundary of the hill country of Samaria and Judea that starts on the Jordan River, while they were outlining the areas to be granted to the proposed Arab state. After rejecting the partition plan, the surrounding Arab states declared war on the nascent state of Israel. In that war, the Jordanians captured Judea and Samaria. A few years later, in the 1950s, the Jordanians, invented the term West Bank in a deliberate attempt to disconnect it from its biblical and Jewish historical identity and to convince the world that it rightfully belongs to Jordan, that it's the bank of the Jordan River. Since then, the name has stuck and is widely used across media and governments worldwide. In a welcome development this past February, the National Religious Broadcasters passed a resolution calling on all Christian media to cease using the misleading and fake term West Bank and restore the use of the original name for this region, Judea and Samaria.
Christians know and read our Bible. We open up our maps in the back and we look at the land that was given to Israel and that God promised to Israel and gave to Israel. And we realize that Judea and Samaria are part of that land. And I think you're right. Words matter today and the truth matters as well. And it is time for us to step up and be honest about the truth of what's happening in Israel and the definition of this land. And so we are privileged and we are honored to stand beside you and to endorse this resolution. And I think Christians across the country will look at this resolution and endorse it as well.
And on February 29th of this year, Congresswoman Claudia Tenney of New York 24 took the fight for truth one step further and introduced legislation demanding that all U.S. official documents and materials cease using the misleading and phony West Bank for the historical heartland of Israel. She joins us now. Representative Tenney, welcome to Eyes on Israel.
Well, thank you. It's such an honor to be on, and thank you for highlighting this great bill, which actually came to me last year. Unfortunately, the events of October 7th happened, and we thought we would just wait to see what would transpire there. And unfortunately, it's a sad, tragic situation. But we thought now is the time to start telling the truth. Not that it's always the time to tell the truth, but I kept hearing West Bank, and I was like, it's not the West Bank. It is Judea and Samaria. And I had the wonderful opportunity to go to Israel twice now. I'd love to go more. But on my second trip to Israel, I went with a group called Young Israel and a wonderful man named Dr. Frager and Mike Huckabee, of all people, a huge Israel supporter. And we actually got a chance to go to a lovely retreat run by a rabbi named Jeremy Gilbert. And he was building this beautiful retreat in Judea. And on one side, you could see the city of Jerusalem gleaming the other end. And then the other side, you could see the Dead Sea. And it was this beautiful spot. And I thought, this is not we were on a so-called settlement, and we heard the history and the biblical history and the long time, 3,000-year history of this place and its rightful legacy to the Jewish people, and how it could all of a sudden be transformed after all the Oslo Accords, after the agreement and the Pompeo Doctrine, and everything. Why are we calling it the West Bank? And I love that. I didn't even know that the broadcasters had done this, actually. I wasn't even aware of it until you just mentioned it a few moments ago. But, it means so much to me to make sure that we are talking in the language of truth and not in the language of revisionism, which is exactly what so many on the left and so many of the really anti-Semitic people want us to talk about. And let's start with the truth, because I think that's really, the most biblical concept we can actually embrace.
Well, thank you for that. And, I also have to add that you're from New York 24, and I just want to talk about a possible elephant in the room to people who are watching, because they see a congressman from New York who's got this pro-Israel piece of legislation, and they probably think, well, she's pandering to her Jewish voters. And you're from New York 24. And if anyone knows anything about the Jewish population of New York, there are a lot of Jews in New York State, but they're not in New York 24. New York 24 has some very small Jewish communities in it. But this is obviously coming from a place of deep belief in just the truth. So I want to commend you for that and thank you for it on behalf of the Jewish people. It's so important. Now, you also have proposed other legislation that defends Israeli sovereignty and Israeli sovereignty in the West Bank specifically, I believe back in August of last year.
Yeah, look, I'm just to get New York 24, I don't even know if 1% of the population is a Jewish population. It isn't about pandering to the Jewish population or Jewish donors or any of that. It really comes from, when I was younger, a college student, there was so much discussion about the Middle East and it sort of made your eyes glaze over because I really didn't know what was going on. And one day I said, this is always in the news. I think I ought to learn about it. And I read some books, and then I got interested, and then I had the good fortune of going to Israel as a freshman in Congress. And it was there that I realized what was really happening in the Holy Land and why it was so important to tell the truth. And it doesn't mean that you have to support the Jewish people and the Jewish state to the exclusion of all of the Arab neighbors who also have a tremendous history. But it's about telling the truth about the history and showing how these groups of people can actually live in harmony. And I will tell you, I lived in the former Yugoslavia. And so I saw, a confluence of so many different religious groups, coming together, but also, with a bad system of government, which ultimately led to the demise of that country. So, but Israel is so special, and it is special not only to Jewish people, Arab people, and Muslims. It's also really important to Christians as well, as everyone knows. And so I think it's really important. And I'm not actually coming from a Christian viewpoint. I'm talking of, look at this situation. How do we get to the facts? Because you really can't come up with a solution without really just bearing down on the facts. So I have been fighting for this, whether it's to quell the problems that we have in Iran from my second term, and I'm in my third term, to also telling the truth about what's really happening and making sure that we understand what's going on with Israel. And that's the basis for all of the legislation I put forward, whether it's a resolution or a bill, to try to make sure we always get to the truth, and it's always constitutional, and it's about preserving freedom, individual rights for everyone, not just one group or another, and protecting our constitutional rights and protecting our allies and those people who agree with our concept. They don't have to agree 100%, but people who understand the concept of freedom and countries that are democratic. And Israel right now is our only democratic partner in the Middle East, among kingdoms and authoritarian governments.
So Representative Tenney, could you tell our audience what they could do to help you with this legislation? I know that a piece of legislation like this needs sponsors, and I don't know what the state of this bill is. Just give them some direction. We have about a minute and a half left. If you could talk about that, and also talk about how people can follow everything you're doing and stay in touch with your with your office and your campaign. It is an election year.
Yes, well, thank you so much. And yeah, first of all, all of my social media platforms are at Claudia Tenney, Tenney. And what people can do is just follow us and join the bill. I have a couple of co-sponsors, Randy Weber out of Texas, and my colleague from New York, Anthony D'Esposito, who joined. But I'd love to have more people. I certainly would love to have some Democrats join me on this legislation, and we're going to be working on doing that along with many other pieces of legislation we put out. But look, my mission is simple. I am in Congress to try to save the republic. Basically, I've already been a lawyer and a partner in my firm. I've run my family business. We still have it. Small business owners in upstate New York. And I just want to make sure that the people I represent and as many people as possible are informed so that we can maintain our self-governance and save it. Look, if people are uninformed, they're not going to make good decisions about voting. And so one thing I do, unfortunately, I'm the only member of Congress to do this, but I urge my colleagues to do the same. I explain every vote that I take in the House of Representatives in detail soon after every vote. I put it on across all social media platforms, all official platforms, and I recap every vote and everything that we've accomplished during the week on my weekend newsletter. And then I do an annual report, and we continue to give people the information as transparently as possible. Obviously, I come from a Republican conservative viewpoint, but we welcome all ideas and all people who are interested in my constituents. Some who I didn't always agree with, maybe I agree with their position now. But it is so important that we have an educated populace that is going to make good decisions on voting. And the more people vote, the better our system is. And that's what I'm trying to urge, inform voters to get out and really take a stand so we can save our self-governance, because the opposite is authoritarianism and misinformation and government top-down against the truth. And I think that's really all it's about in the end. So thank you so much for having me on. I'm grateful for this show, too.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Congresswoman Claudia Tenney, and thank you for standing for truth at this time when there's so much falsehood out there. We'll be right back with more Eyes on Israel right after this.